The hot wind blew across the desert, stirring up golden dust under the red sky. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows over a city that seemed impassable. Built in the middle of nowhere, protected by walls that reached the heavens, Jericho was a true miracle of civilization. For those who saw it from afar, that fortress was a symbol of power, prosperity, and absolute security. But within the walls, away from foreign eyes, there was another side to this story. Its inhabitants believed they were invincible. They walked through vibrant streets, noisy markets, and temples lit by the glow of torches. There was no fear, just parties, riches, and promises of an eternal future. But history teaches us that nothing lasts forever. The city that seemed untouchable suddenly collapsed, leaving behind only ruins and unanswered questions. Now, imagine for a moment that you are there, walking the streets of Jericho, listening to the voices of the merchants, smelling the spices, and watching the priests perform rituals in the name of forgotten gods. Do you believe these walls could fall? Would it be possible that, in a matter of moments, an entire city would be reduced to silence? The answer is hidden in buried traces, in ancient stories, and in records that defy time. What really happened in Jericho? Was it a natural collapse or a supernatural event? And most importantly, does this story have anything to teach us for today? Archaeologists, over the decades, have excavated its ruins and found evidence of a grand and turbulent past. Some say it was an earthquake that caused its destruction. Others claim it was an unknown war strategy. But there is a third possibility, one that defies logical explanation. Jericho was not just any city. Its strategic position and abundance of resources made it one of humanity's first urban centers. But there was something more, something that attracted attention and, according to ancient accounts, aroused the ire of forces far greater than armies or natural disasters. This story is much more than an account of the past. It echoes to this day in the challenges that society faces, in the choices that repeat the mistakes of fallen civilizations. Jericho became a symbol of a larger dilemma, a warning etched in the dust of time. In this account, we will explore every detail of this mystery, from the birth of the city and its rise to the events that led to its fall. What was behind his glory? How did its people live? And more importantly, what led to their sudden destruction? If you've heard of this city, get ready to discover what the history books don't tell you. And if you've never heard this name before, know that understanding Jericho can change the way you see the world today. Jericho ignored the signs of his own ruin until it was too late. But you can do it differently. Most people who watch the videos have not yet subscribed to the channel, and this simple gesture can strengthen this space so we can continue exploring fascinating stories like this. If this content made sense to you, subscribe now and turn on notifications. And if you believe that learning from the past helps us build a better future, leave a like. Your support keeps this knowledge alive. Long before the great metropolises of antiquity, before the pyramids of Egypt and the temples of Mesopotamia, there was a place where humanity took its first steps towards civilization. Between arid hills and fertile lands, surrounded by sources of fresh water, Jericho was born. Scholars estimate that this city emerged more than 10,000 years ago, making it one of the first known permanent settlements. At a time when the world was dominated by nomadic tribes who roamed in search of food, a group of people decided to settle in a single location. This moment marked a decisive change for humanity. Jericho was not built by chance. Its location, in the heart of the Fertile Crescent, was chosen wisely. Located on the banks of the Jordan River, the city had access to one of the region's greatest resources: water. While other tribes depended on rain or had to constantly migrate to avoid drought, the inhabitants of Jericho had a unique advantage. Close to a natural spring, the city has become an oasis in the middle of the desert. This abundance allowed the cultivation of wheat, barley, and dates, guaranteeing food and stability. The presence of water also attracted travelers and traders. It was an essential crossing point for caravans transporting goods between different regions. From its earliest days, Jericho stood out as an economic center. The inhabitants not only cultivated, but also exchanged products with neighboring peoples. With the growth of the population and the increase in wealth, new concerns arose. The city needed to protect itself from invaders and rival tribes who tried to plunder its crops and livestock. This is how the first known walls in history emerged. Unlike other early settlements, which were vulnerable to attack, Jericho erected an impressive structure for its time. Archaeologists have discovered traces of walls built around 8,000 years before the current era. They were made of stone and clay and reached more than 10 meters in height. Some were so wide you could walk on them. This defensive system made Jericho a true refuge, a symbol of power and security. The city grew into a prosperous center where rulers and priests began to exert influence. Jericho was not just a group of houses surrounded by walls. It had a complex organization for the time. As its population grew, social needs also grew. The inhabitants began to divide tasks. Some became farmers, others potters, artisans, or builders. The city had leaders responsible for making decisions and managing resources. The first temples began to emerge, indicating that religion already played a central role in people's lives. The economy strengthened as Jericho established trade routes. Salt extracted from the Dead Sea region was one of the most valuable goods, being exchanged for metals, fabrics, and spices from distant lands. Trade brought influence and knowledge, allowing new techniques to be adopted. Jericho's prosperity was not just in the walls or in agriculture. Culture flourished within the city. Excavations have revealed artistic objects, statues, and ornaments used for both religious and decorative purposes. Temples were large centers of worship, where priests performed rituals to ensure good harvests and protection from disasters. The population believed that their gods granted favors in exchange for offerings and ceremonies. Archaeological remains indicate that the inhabitants developed advanced construction techniques, including stone structures that resisted time and natural phenomena. The city was ahead of its time, while other people still lived nomadically. Jericho grew in size, influence, and power. Its people saw themselves as protected, untouchable within its walls. Confidence in its prosperity caused the city to begin to change. The leaders began to live in luxury, feeding the idea that nothing could overthrow them. Religious rituals became increasingly elaborate, involving offerings and practices that would later be questioned. The city was no longer just a refuge in the desert. It was a symbol of wealth and opulence. Temples glittered with precious metals, markets sold exotic fabrics, and festivals became increasingly grand. But history shows us that no civilization grows indefinitely without consequences. When confidence turns into arrogance, the foundations that support success begin to crumble. And that's exactly what happened to Jericho. What began as a miracle of civilization would soon become an example of how prosperity can lead to decadence. The path was traced, and the first signs of ruin were already beginning to appear within the city. Now that we understand how Jericho became one of humanity's first great urban centers, a new question arises. How could such a powerful city, with such imposing walls and countless riches, succumb? In the next chapter, we will explore the dark details of your society. The culture that once symbolized progress and innovation began to take a dangerous turn. The beliefs that supported Jericho's power became the reason for its downfall. The city that was once one of the most advanced in history would soon become an example of moral decay and corruption. What happened within its walls would change its destiny forever. When walking through the busy streets of Jericho, it was impossible to ignore the symbols engraved on the walls of the temples and on the objects of worship scattered around the altars. Statues of deities with stern expressions, torches lit before figures carved in stone, and mysterious chants echoing among the mud brick buildings. Spirituality was part of everyday life, but not everything that happened within the walls was sacred. Belief in superior beings was the basis of life in that society. The gods were seen as responsible for the fertility of the land, the success of the harvests, and the safety of the inhabitants. To maintain balance, priests and rulers performed ceremonies, which ranged from simple offerings to practices that today would be considered unthinkable. The population lived under the conviction that each natural event was linked to the will of these entities. If the harvest was plentiful, it was a sign that the spirits were satisfied. If a storm destroyed part of the city, it was believed that a mistake had been made. This fear and this need to maintain order led to the creation of increasingly elaborate rituals. The temples were the most imposing buildings in Jericho. Built with carefully carved stones, they served as centers of worship and also as places for the administration of justice and politics. Priests had a prominent position, as they were seen as intermediaries between mortals and divine beings. It was to them that the people turned for guidance and protection. Inside these sacred constructions, different practices were carried out. Some involved singing and dancing, while others required sacrifices. To ensure the continuity of blessings, priests offered food, perfumes, and even animals in rituals that became increasingly intense. However, at certain times, reports indicate that these sacrifices went beyond what can be imagined. In some religious traditions of the time, it was believed that the greatest demonstration of devotion was the offering of what was most valuable. In certain periods, this belief led to the performance of rituals involving human lives. Children were chosen to be handed over to the gods in ceremonies that took place under the light of bonfires. These practices were not seen as cruel by their participants, but rather as a necessity to ensure the city remained prosperous. Another aspect that stood out was the presence of ritualistic prostitution. Fertility was one of the central concepts of Jericho's religious culture. It was believed that the fields would only produce good harvests if the gods of the land were pleased. To achieve this, certain ceremonies involved relationships within the temples themselves, where priestesses played a role considered sacred. This type of worship was common in several ancient civilizations, but in Jericho, it became an essential part of everyday life. The rulers supported these practices, as they understood that maintaining the people's faith meant maintaining control. The fear of displeasing the gods prevented questioning and ensured that traditions continued to be followed. Over time, this relationship between power and religion strengthened the priestly class, which began to influence political and economic decisions. The city stood out for its large number of religious festivals. These were periods where the population gathered to celebrate, give thanks, and reinforce their beliefs. During these festivities, the markets were crowded, the streets were filled with colors and music, and the consumption of food and drinks increased considerably. It was a moment of unity, but also of excess. At the same time that religion brought order and hope, it also became an instrument of domination. Those who questioned certain rituals were seen as disrespectful and often excluded from society. The idea that the gods punished the disobedient made everyone follow traditions without hesitation. As the years passed, Jericho's religious practices began to become more and more extravagant. The luxury of the temples grew, the priests became more influential, and the ceremonies required increasingly greater sacrifices. This behavior transformed the city, moving it away from its simple origins and strengthening a culture where faith and wealth went hand in hand. The city, which at first prospered due to the unity between its inhabitants, began to divide between those who had power and those who merely obeyed. Rulers and religious leaders enjoyed the privileges of their position, while the rest of the population followed increasingly rigorous rituals, believing that only in this way could they guarantee their survival. This organizational model made Jericho not only an economic and military center, but also a symbol of absolute devotion. But to what extent was religion a way of keeping peace? At what point did spiritual practices stop being a reflection of faith and became justifications for control and exploitation? Jericho has become an example of how arrogance can blind a civilization, but we are only halfway through this story. If you are involved in this journey and want to continue discovering more about this mystery, take the opportunity now to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps a lot to bring more content like this and keep this historical investigation alive. Let's go together until the end of this story. Jericho became a city where belief and power were inseparably intertwined. While the population believed that their actions would guarantee prosperity, leaders took advantage of their influence to reinforce their position. This dynamic led the city to a period of apparent stability, but behind the festivities and promises of blessings, a growing tension was taking place. When faith mixes with power in an uncontrolled way, the balance is disrupted. What was once devotion became fear. What should have been hope turned into submission. And when a society loses its freedom to question, it heads towards an inevitable destiny. The splendor of Jericho would not last forever. The city that had become an example of grandeur began to lose itself in its own arrogance. Luxury and extravagant rituals brought a feeling of invincibility. But history shows us that no civilization is untouchable when its foundations are corrupted. In the corridors of the temples, in the streets lit by torches, and in the parties that lasted all night, few realized that the fate of Jericho was already sealed. As their leaders celebrated, outside forces approached. What was about to happen would not only change the future of the city, but would go down in history as one of the most impactful events in antiquity. The streets of Jericho were still full of life. Merchants traded rare spices, priests pronounced blessings on luxurious offerings, and nobles paraded among imposing buildings. However, behind this scenario of prosperity, something deeper was happening. The city that once prided itself on its order and tradition began to lose itself. The wealth accumulated over the years has caused governments to distance themselves from the needs of the population. Luxury and power went to the heads of those at the top, and the principles that supported the city were left aside. What was once a place of safety and progress has now become a stage for abuse and inequality. Religion, which had once been the basis of morality, began to serve selfish interests. Temples, once symbols of devotion, became centers of political influence. Priests not only dictated spiritual rules, but also controlled trade and land distribution. Those who questioned his decisions were seen as threats and often forced into silence. The worship of the gods, which in its origins meant respect for life and nature, had become a justification for questionable practices. Rituals involving human sacrifices were increasingly common, and the justification was always the same: keeping the city protected. But the truth was that these acts served more to consolidate the power of the priests and rulers than to secure any divine blessing. The laws, which once existed to protect citizens, now favor only a small elite. Unscrupulous traders raised grain prices, while the humblest workers struggled to survive. Those who held wealth were able to manipulate trials and escape any punishment. The concept of justice had become an illusion accessible only to those with influence. Corruption spread across all layers of society. The city's politics were conducted based on favors and betrayals, and alliances were made and broken according to the personal interests of the most powerful. Bribes were the basis of decisions, and any attempt to challenge them was quickly suppressed. The arrogance of the ruling class caused the city's security to be neglected. The absolute confidence in the walls and internal armies generated a feeling of invincibility. It was believed that no enemy would be able to cross those impenetrable barriers. This overconfidence caused basic defense measures to be ignored. Far removed from the principles that once sustained its growth, Jericho was plunged into a spiral of decadence. Religious festivities, which in the past were moments of reflection and celebration, have become events of excess. Drinks were consumed without control, and acts of immorality took place in plain sight. The rulers, increasingly concerned with their own pleasures, left city administration aside. Essential structures began to deteriorate, streets became abandoned, and even the water supply became a source of dispute between the upper classes and ordinary citizens. The unrestrained luxury contrasted with the poverty that grew in the more remote neighborhoods. While the most privileged feasted on tables filled with delicacies brought from distant lands, the working population could barely guarantee enough food for their children. Inequality became an insurmountable abyss. The city was no longer an example of harmony and progress. Selfishness and the incessant search for pleasure had taken the place of responsibility and respect for others. Traditions were distorted, and the culture that once promoted collective growth turned into a system where only the strongest and most influential prospered. The story of Jericho teaches us something essential. When a society abandons its values and allows corruption and inequality to take hold, its ruin becomes inevitable. No wall, no matter how solid, is capable of resisting when the moral foundations are crumbling from within. Jericho's destiny was set, but few were able to see it. To its inhabitants, the city still seemed grand, wealth still circulated, temples were still frequented, and parties continued to take place. But time would show that all this apparent stability was just an illusion about to fall apart. While the city continued to ignore the signs of its own fall, much larger forces were already moving. What was to come would change everything, so quickly and devastatingly that no one could have predicted it. What happens when an entire city believes nothing can bring it down? What happens when arrogance and blindness prevent us from seeing approaching danger? These questions would soon be answered in the most drastic way possible. Jericho's fate was already sealed, and its destruction would become one of the most memorable stories of antiquity. The sun rose over Jericho, bathing its imposing walls in a golden glow. From the top, the guards looked at the horizon with confidence. No army, no matter how strong, would dare challenge that fortress. The walls, built from stone blocks and reinforced over the centuries, were a symbol of unshakable security. The rulers believed that no enemy would have enough strength to overthrow them. The people continued their routine, without imagining that that day would be different from all the others. But something was happening beyond the walls. A group of foreigners had approached the city, but instead of launching a direct attack, they adopted a completely unexpected strategy. For days at a time, they marched around Jericho in silence, without shooting arrows or raising swords. They just walked, guided by a mysterious purpose. The inhabitants watched everything with disdain. For them, this was nothing more than a futile attempt to intimidate the city. Time passed, and the soldiers inside the walls began to feel something different. The behavior of those invaders made no sense. Where were the catapults? Why didn't they try to climb the walls? Why did they just circle the city over and over again? Gradually, a feeling of unrest spread among the residents. What seemed like an illogical tactic began to arouse growing fear. Then, the seventh day arrived. This time, the sound of silence was replaced by a deafening boom. Trumpets sounded loudly, and powerful voices echoed through the air. A collective scream took over the environment, reverberating against the stones that supported the city. At that moment, something unthinkable happened. The walls, which for centuries had resisted storms, wars, and time itself, began to shake. The ground beneath the inhabitants' feet moved as if something deep was breaking. Before they could understand what was happening, gigantic cracks appeared in the walls, stretching from one end to the other. In a matter of seconds, what seemed indestructible collapsed before the terrified eyes of the population. Panic spread through the streets. People ran in all directions, seeking shelter in a place where nothing else offered protection. What was once a safe haven now turned into a maze of dust and rubble. The walls, the great symbol of Jericho's invincibility, had been reduced to ruins. Those who survived the destruction realized that they were defenseless. The barriers that separated them from the outside world no longer existed. The army that had previously seemed distant now advanced without encountering any resistance. The city's fate was sealed. Archaeologists and scholars over the years have tried to explain what could have caused this sudden collapse. Some theories suggest that an earthquake may have been responsible. The Jericho region is close to a geological fault, where tremors are relatively common. But even if this were true, the coincidence of the event with the march of the invaders remains an intriguing mystery. Another hypothesis points to flaws in the structure of the walls. Over time, building materials may have worn out, making walls more vulnerable to any impact. However, that still doesn't explain why everything collapsed at the exact moment screams and the sound of trumpets echoed through the city. For those who believe in superior forces, the fall of Jericho was not an accident, but rather an inevitable consequence of a city that completely strayed from any principle of justice and balance. The arrogance of the leaders, the corruption of the priests, and the belief that nothing could overthrow them became the true responsible for their destruction. No fortress built by human hands can stand when its very foundations are corroded from within. The fall of Jericho was not just a physical event. It was the end of an era, the conclusion of a story that had unfolded over generations. The pride that sustained that society was shattered along with the walls. What remained were the ashes of a city that was once prosperous, but which did not know how to perceive the signs of its own ruin. This event became a landmark in history, not only for the destruction of the city, but for the meaning behind it. Jericho became a symbol that no structure, no matter how strong it may seem, is unshakable. When a society becomes convinced that it is indestructible and refuses to look at its own mistakes, its downfall becomes just a matter of time. The remains of Jericho's walls still exist today, buried under layers of earth and dust. Excavators have found traces of what was once a grand city, now reduced to fragments of the past. But his story lives on, as a warning to all who believe that power and wealth are eternal. In the end, Jericho did not fall just because of a supernatural event or a natural disaster. It fell because, even before its walls crumbled, its principles had already been destroyed. The true ruin of a civilization does not happen overnight. It starts from the inside out, long before the moment the walls finally break. The destruction of Jericho marked not just the end of a city, but the beginning of a new era. The world changed after this event, and the lessons left by this story spanned the centuries. But there is something even more impressive that needs to be told. What happened after the fall of Jericho? How did this destruction impact the future of the region? And did other cities follow the same path? The answers to these questions reveal even more secrets about the fate of entire civilizations. Time erased the screams that echoed through the streets of Jericho. Its walls, once imposing, became ruins buried by desert dust. However, its history continues to live on, and the events that led to its destruction still bring profound reflections on the fate of civilizations. What happened in that city was not just an isolated episode from the past, but a warning that spans the centuries and applies to the present day. Immense self-confidence and the belief in one's own invulnerability were hallmarks of the Jericho culture. The city rose as an example of power, accumulating wealth and building defenses to protect itself from any threat. For generations, its inhabitants believed they were above any danger. But this security was an illusion. What seemed unshakable collapsed in an instant, and what was left was just the silence of a society that ignored the signs of its own decadence. How many times throughout history have other nations followed this same path? Great empires grew up believing that their supremacy would last forever, only to see their structures crumble in the face of internal corruption, arrogance, and the loss of fundamental values. The Roman Empire, which ruled vast lands with military strength and cultural influence, fell not through a single battle, but through gradual wear and tear caused by excessive luxury, inequality, and lack of discipline. Babylon, once a shining center of knowledge and wealth, lost its glory when pride took the place of prudence. Today's world is not so far from this reality. Modern civilizations pride themselves on their technological progress, their robust economies, and their ability to influence the globe. However, are we making the same mistakes as Jericho? Just as that city ignored the warning signs, many societies today refuse to see the problems growing within their own walls. The unbridled pursuit of power and wealth continues to be a factor that can lead to the decline of any nation. Excessive confidence in political and economic structures without due care for the values that sustain society is a constant risk. When pride blinds a people and corruption spreads among its leaders, the foundations begin to crumble, even if the walls appear solid from the outside. Inequality was also a determining factor in the fall of Jericho. The common population faced hardships, while a minority enjoyed unlimited privileges. This same pattern can be observed in many parts of the world today. The gap between the richest and the poorest grows every year, and many governments face challenges in balancing the needs of their populations. If history teaches us anything, it is that no society can sustain itself indefinitely when injustice becomes the basis of its structure. Another point that led Jericho to ruin was moral decadence. What began as a prosperous and organized culture has transformed into a society obsessed with immediate pleasures and rituals without real purpose. Temples, once symbols of spirituality, became centers of exploration, where faith was used as justification for questionable practices. Religiosity stopped being a guide for conduct and became a means of manipulation. Today, it is easy to see how this same scenario is repeated in different places. Rampant materialism has taken the place of solid principles, and many people live focused only on the present, ignoring the consequences of their actions for the future. When a society loses its identity and its values are corrupted, it becomes vulnerable, regardless of the strength of its institutions. Jericho also teaches us about the importance of humility. The city believed it would never be destroyed, as its walls were strong and its people were prosperous. However, no physical structure can resist when the foundation that supports it is already compromised. Pride can lead any person or nation to fall if there is no vigilance and discernment to recognize one's own mistakes. The greatest lesson this ancient city leaves us is that true power does not lie in riches, armies, or walls. It lies in integrity, justice, and the ability to learn from the past. The story of Jericho is not just an account of the destruction of an ancient city. It is a mirror that reflects the challenges faced by the modern world. If there is anything that can prevent history from repeating itself, it is the wisdom of looking back and understanding what led to the downfall of previous civilizations. Past mistakes do not have to be present mistakes. There is always time to change the direction of a society, as long as there is a willingness to recognize what needs to be fixed. The ruin of Jericho did not happen overnight. It was the result of years of wrong choices, arrogance, and departure from the principles that once supported the city. This same process may be happening today, before our eyes. The question is, will we have the wisdom to see the signs and act before it is too late? History never completely erases. It repeats itself to those who do not pay attention to its lessons. Jericho fell, but his warning continues to echo through the ages. If we want to build a strong future, we need to learn from the mistakes of the past and ensure that our own walls don't crumble in the same way. Jericho's fate was not sealed the moment its walls collapsed. Its downfall began long before, in the days when its leaders let arrogance cloud common sense, when justice was replaced by self-interest and spirituality was used as a tool of control. The city, which once symbolized progress and prosperity, has become an example of what happens when a society ignores warning signs. The lesson that this story leaves us is not just in the rubble of its ancient buildings, but in the pattern that repeats itself throughout history. The collapse of Jericho was not an isolated event. Other civilizations followed the same path, believing themselves to be unshakable, only to discover, too late, that no wealth, wall, or army can protect a people corrupt from within. The modern world faces similar challenges. Overconfidence in economic power, growing inequality, and a lack of solid principles mean that many societies are heading down a dangerous path. The question remains, are we learning from past mistakes or just repeating them on a larger scale? The true strength of a civilization lies not in its imposing buildings, but in what supports its values. No empire, nation, or city is immune to fall when its foundations are corroded by greed, corruption, and disregard for the truth. Jericho became a warning etched in the dust of time, a reminder that no man-made fortress is eternal. If there is one thing we can take away from this story, it is the need for vigilance. The greatest threat to any society comes not from outside, but from within. As long as there is the ability to recognize mistakes and correct course, there is hope. But if the signs are ignored, the outcome will be inevitable. The echo of the trumpets that announced the fall of Jericho may have fallen silent millennia ago, but their message lives on. The question is, will we listen to this warning, or will we follow the same path, believing, like the inhabitants of that city, that we are protected by walls that, in the end, will not be able to save us? Jericho showed us that no wall can resist when the foundations of a society are corrupted. If this story made you reflect, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next content we are preparing. Your support helps us continue to bring you research and stories like this. And of course, leave a like, as this strengthens this community even more. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.